Ciao e benvenuti nel podcast degli additti alla storia mondiale. Il mio nome è Devon e oggi parlerò con il mio co-host Nick sulla storia antica dell'Italia, a partire dalle navigazioni di Colombo e dalle guerre italiane fino all'età napoleonica e alla riunificazione dell'Italia. Iniziamo. Hello, and welcome to the World History Addicts Podcast, a show where we discuss history and global politics through a social and anthropological lens. My name is Devon, and today I'll be diving into part 2 of our Italian history trilogy. I'll be talking with my co host Nick about the early modern history of Italy, starting from the voyages of Columbus and the Italian Wars into the Napoleonic Age and the reunification of Italy. Let's begin.
So, Devin, what was the early modern era like, and when does it begin?
So the early modern era is really the end of the medieval era, which ends sometime either between the fall of Constantinople in 1453 or the voyages of Columbus in 1492, which coincidentally is also when the Reconquista, which is the Christian Spaniards kicking out the Muslims and later the Jews out of Iberia.
Got it. Okay. I know that we ended the last podcast kind of with the end of the medieval era, right? In Italy, and this whole series is kind of focusing on the Italian history. So, I mean, like, could you kind of actually, first of all, my bad. You mentioned the Reconquista. I'm going to backtrack. You mentioned the Reconquista, right, in Spain and everything. Could you kind of give some details about that stuff?
Yeah, so in the year 711, not the convenience store, the year 711, a group of Moors from from North Africa invaded into Iberia and managed to take over. In fact, they kept expanding all the way into southern France, where they were actually driven back by a bunch of French knights under the legendary Charles the Hammer or Charles Martel.
Okay.
So for the next 700 or so years, Spain was under the control of various Muslim dynasties. Some of them were native-born within Iberia, but others came later from other factions within North Africa because at some point they started losing strength. So they called upon more radical groups like the Almoravids and later the Almohads from, I think, what's now Morocco and Algeria.
Okay.
Brought them in, but unfortunately it backfired because these same guys just got more and more radical. They started sowing division within Muslim society, and they also radicalized the Christians against them, which eventually led to them being fragmented and later kicked out by the 1400s.
Okay.
Yeah, so another thing to keep in mind is that this is also really where world history starts to materialize, because before the late 1400s, there were many local histories. Like there was the history of Rome and the history of the Mediterranean. There was a history of Persia and the history of India. There was a history of China and many different African histories.
Mm-hmm.
But because travel was much more restricted and it was much harder to get around, and also just trade networks weren't as developed as they would be later, it was much more isolated. And world history really only starts to show up around the late 1400s because you have pretty much the same people traveling around the world, which is actually exactly what happened. Is there in the early 1500s a crew of Spaniards and a Portuguese captain named Ferdinand Magellan, who's actually the guy the Straits of Magellan at the southernmost tip of Argentina is actually named after. They sail from Spain to South America. They sail all the way down the coast to Argentina. They go through the straits to the other Pacific side of South America. Then they go across the Pacific all the way to the Philippines, where Magellan ends up being killed by a group of angry Filipinos.
Oh, wow.
And then from there, they travel back to the coast of Asia and then all the way around Africa to Spain.
Okay, so it sounds like this era, right, of like this is where we're coming out of the Middle Ages, we're entering the early modern era of history is where you're saying that it really starts to begin at conquest. Like that's where we really start tracking where we are now, right? Is we start tracking when people started to sail the seas and really started to get out of Europe, right? That's what you're saying?
Yeah. The 1400s is also the beginning of what's called the Age of Exploration, which is where all these different European explorers start getting on ships that can now sail across oceans. Okay. Because back during the Roman era, sailing across the Mediterranean wasn't anything new because they did it all the time. They were At one point the official Mediterranean Empire. They had territory on both coasts.
Who was that?
The Romans.
Oh, the Romans.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they had North African territories, they had Southern European territories. They even had territory in the Levant.
Yeah.
Like,
Okay.
What's now called Israel and Palestine,
Okay.
as well as Egypt too. So,
Okay.
what was I saying? But yeah, but the big definitive point where the early modern era begins, because I think it's still kind of debated on whether the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans is really the beginning of the early modern period. But
I
the
see.
voyages of Columbus, where he sails from Spain all the way to Cuba and Hispaniola, is definitely considered the beginning of this era.
Gotcha. Okay. And since this is the a deep dive on Italian history, what's going on in Italy around this time, right? It seems that almost Italy is taking like backstage almost.
Yeah, because Christopher Columbus himself was actually not Spanish or just Italian, because at this point in time, there is no Italy. There is no united Italian state.
Okay.
There are many different independent Italian states, and there are also territories that are owned by outsiders, like Sicily and Sardinia.
The Venetian Republic, right?
The Venetians are. The thing is that they're a city-state, but they're so powerful and so efficient that they effectively act like their own mini empire.
I'm going back to the little notes we took on the last episode where you talk about the city-states. Because I forgot it got broken up basically after the fall of Rome, and it kind of was just like this for a long
Italy
time.
became kind of a free-for-all for all these different players. Some of them local, others foreign, and everyone kind of wanted a piece of Italy.
Okay.
Yeah. So, what was I talking? Yeah, and that's exactly what went on in the 1490s, because right after Columbus's voyage, and actually I think maybe during them, because Columbus made multiple voyages to and from the New World to the back to the Old World and back.
Yeah.
And at this point, there are all these different factions fighting across Italy. It's called the Italian Wars for that reason.
Yes.
And it's also where a very infamous character named Niccolo Machiavelli shows up, because he looks at all the chaos that's going on in Italy and realizes that you can make a kind of a theory of politics out of everything that's going on. He realizes really quickly that at that point in time, it's better to be feared than to be loved, or even better to be feared than to be trusted.
Okay.
Because everything is backstabbing, cutthroat, betrayals, conquest. It's really nasty time, honestly.
Is that what real politic is?
Yes, it's exactly. Real politic is just an amoral, cold look at what you should, really more what you can do and what will give you an advantage, instead of what the right thing to do is, what the moral thing to do is. All of that just goes out the window. It's really just do whatever you have to do to win. And I suppose that type of thinking is actually very popular today, because even if you don't like it, you're probably going to end up working for someone who follows Niccolo Machiavelli's rules, whether they realize it or not.
Okay, for some reason, I always thought Machiavelli was just like an artist or something. he has that kind of name. But anyways, okay, so that's going on in Italy. What else is going on in Italy during that time?
Well, the Italians are also being I would say the forerunners to the Protestant Reformation are mostly active in Italy. There was a radical named Girolamo Savonarola, and he showed up in, I think it was Florence. She showed up there, tried to instate his own mini theocracy. He tried to destroy much of the art, and eventually he was burned at the stake for being a heretic.
Oh my goodness! Okay.
Yeah, he was a rather radical figure. There's also, on the more skeptical side, a man named Lorenzo Valla, and his claim to fame is challenging this document called the Donation of Constantine. The Catholic Church used this document as proof that the Roman Empire had given them authority in certain areas indefinitely, as in he had just given it to them. And as the emperor, his word was eternal law.
Yeah.
But it started to raise issues, because by this point, this is the 1500s, or actually, no, the 1400s. They're looking into the text, and they realize this couldn't have possibly been written at the time that it claimed it was, because it was supposed to be from the 400s AD, when really it looks like it was written sometime in the 800s AD. The reason being is that they looked at some of the words, and they realized some of these words didn't exist during the 400s. They were talking about terms like fief, which is like a mini kingdom, and those didn't exist in the 400s.
Well, so what document is this again?
The Donation of Constantine.
Okay, gotcha.
And eventually they realized this is a complete forgery. It's a fake document that was made by the Catholic Church to solidify their hold on power.
Yeah.
And it basically has nothing to stand on.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, my understanding of the Reformation was that people were starting to read the Bible and actually be able to read because of the printing press, right?
Exactly. So the printing press first shows up in this era, and it's also when more and more information is becoming widespread to common people.
Yeah.
where it hadn't been before. And that's actually, I think, the reason why this particular era in the 1500s is where the Protestant Reformation actually gets off the ground and becomes a real movement that shapes the whole continent instead of being just kind of a one-off type of heresy that just gets stamped out by the church authorities.
Okay.
Because there had actually been multiple rebellions against Catholic authorities before. I believe during the 1300s, there's this other group called the Hussites in Bohemia, like where the Czech Republic is today.
Mm-hmm.
They became really infamous because they used these tactics, like using wagons with like crossbowmen and like gunners inside to like take down knights.
Oh, really?
Which was not something anyone expected at the time, because usually when the knights roll in, the peasants get folded. But in this case, the peasants managed to fight back.
Wow, that's like a medieval drive-by.
Oh yeah. It's, yeah. I think the comparison was like they're kind of like the Humvees of the medieval world.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Okay. So the Protestant Reformation is going on. You said there's a.
It's not going on in Italy, but it certainly has a major effect because it also provokes the Counter-Reformation, which is both the heavy crackdown on any kind of Protestantism or heresy, but at the same time, it's also a internal cleaning up of the church, because the Catholic Church is very corrupt by this point. There's lots of indulgences. That's where the priest will, in effect, ask you to bribe them to forgive your sins.
That's right. Like you can go buy an indulgence. From my understanding was you can buy an indulgence and then you can just go do whatever you want because it's been cleared by God. Is that in essence correct, or is it?
Yeah, pretty much. It's like you can just like pay money and they will forgive your sins. And Martin Luther takes real issue to this because his view on it is you can't just do certain good works to make up for a lack of faith, because at the end of the day, faith is really what saves you, not how much money you can spend and not how much how many good, quote unquote, good deeds you can do to make yourself look better than you are.
Yeah. Okay.
And of course, this cascades into the European wars of religion, because as soon as the idea that you can rebel against the church and that perhaps the church are actually the heretics, not the Protestants, many German princes start hopping on this bandwagon. They start rebelling against the church, partly because for faith-related reasons, others because it's just out of sheer money. Because now that they don't have to obey the church, they can pretty much go their own way.
Yeah, they can probably power grab,
profit on their own terms.
Okay.
And then this leads into the 30 Years' War, which isn't entirely religious. It was also a political battle between the French and the Habsburgs, but it was mostly kicked off by a rebellion in Bohemia carried out by Protestants.
Oh, okay. The 30 Years' War, right?
Yeah, from 1618 to 1648.
Okay.
It was a very, very bloody conflict because back in the day, the main way of waging war is with mercenaries. You know, you hire thugs to fight the battles for you. But if the thugs don't get paid, or if they don't get what they want, they just go out and start pillaging the local peasants.
Okay.
And because of that, millions and millions of people die over this 3-decade period.
Wow. You say this is mainly in Northern Europe, but parts of Northern Italy were affected as well?
Yes, parts of Northern Italy, like I believe it was Venice and Milan, are affected, partly because of fighting, because there's also a front in the north between Habsburgs and the French, but also because plagues are spreading. Plagues are already go on even in peace times, but warfare and people getting killed and like supply shipments getting blocked and all that certainly doesn't help.
Doesn't sound fun. Doesn't sound like a fun time to be alive.
Yeah, but to make matters worse, there's also another enemy out to the east, the Ottomans.
Okay.
They'd been around since the late 1200s. I believe the first year they showed up was the year 1299.
Okay.
But it's really not until the 1400s that they start to become really relevant, at least in say, the Mediterranean, because they'd already been expanding into the Balkans, taking territory, defending themselves. But one of the main battles they get into is one with the Timurids, who are another Turkic dynasty from Central Asia. I think today Timur, who's the founder of this dynasty, would have been an Uzbek. He was from Uzbekistan, but he lived in Persia, so Iran, and from there his empire expanded brutally across the Middle East. They killed, I think, somewhere in the ballpark of like 25 million people. It's a crazy amount of people at this time. Something like 10% of the world's population were killed by this guy. He kind of viewed himself as like the next Genghis Khan.
And then you said the Ottoman Empire, it pretty much stretches all over the Middle East, right? And even takes over Sicily. Is that correct?
I don't believe they ever take over Sicily. That was a different a dynasty called the Oglobids. They were more based in North Africa. So the Ottomans are based in the Balkans. So that's Southeast Europe and Anatolia, which is also known as Asia Minor. That's where Turkey is today.
Okay. Sorry, I had my O's mixed up.
However, the Ottomans, so the Ottomans have this almost like octopus-shaped empire, where it's like their western frontier extends across northern Africa. The southern frontier goes across the like East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. And then the eastern frontier extends it to the borders of Persia. Sometimes it's the Safavids. There were later dynasties like the Afsharids too, but at this point it's the Safavids. That's in the 1500s.
Dumb question. Persia doesn't exist anymore, right? Now,
Persia. No, the thing is that Persia does exist. It's nowhere near as big as it used to be. Like during the Roman era, there was the Parthians, there were the Sassanids, they were this massive empire. And
okay.
But over time, they've lost ground. There are other dynasties that took power from them.
I'm trying to look at the map. Where is Persia on the map? Is it still a country called Persia?
The current name is now Iran, but it's right. It's right here. So it's right to the east of Iraq and Syria.
Oh, okay.
To the northeast of Saudi Arabia and all these Gulf Arab states. That's where Persia is.
Wow. All right. Side note. I'm just trying to visualize all these locations that we're talking about on a map, because you said it kind of looks like an octopus. I could see it kind of like you said, it kind of stretches out and goes over the sea and stuff like that. I mean,
the Ottomans are, because the Ottomans are really the state that eventually became the Republic of Turkey today.
Okay.
Yeah. But in the 1500s, they started expanding into the Mediterranean, too. There's all these pirates who are funded by the Ottomans. And the thing is, they actually keep going on up until like the early 1800s, where they finally get shut down by the U.S. Marines, of all people, because...
Oh, really?
Yeah. At this point, that's in like the late 1700s, early 1800s. The Barbary Coast is pretty much a mecca for all these different North African pirates.
Where's the Barbary Coast? Sorry.
It's just like the coast of North Africa. Like,
okay.
Libya, Algeria, Tunisia. Yeah, so those main three countries. They send out pirates. They raid the coasts of like southern Europe, even sometimes northern Europe. They'll actually sail all the way around Spain, get up to like Britain, Ireland, northern France, even Iceland at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah, they actually managed to go all the way up into the Atlantic and raid Iceland.
Wow. Okay.
Only to come back with captives. But the Americans are able to deal with them because, unlike the Europeans, who actually have to fear reprisal attacks, because like if the French decide that they want to start fighting back against the pirates, well, the pirates can just agree to just target French ships even more heavily.
Oh, wow.
So it's easier just to pay them off. With the Americans, that's kind of a problem because they can't actually sail all the way across the Atlantic and keep themselves supplied and actually fight a war against the Americans. So the Americans can pretty much just come in and just send in expeditionary forces to beat up the pirates, and they can't really do anything in return. So that's pretty much why the Barbary Coast gets stamped out.
Okay, so you said that, and that's in the 1800s?
Yeah, that was kind of a step forward all the way into the 1800s.
Okay,
but in the 1500s, the Ottomans are still very powerful, and they can. They tried to attack Malta in 1565, which only fails because the defenders are able to hold out long enough until Spanish reinforcements come in and kick the Ottomans off. And then there's the Battle of Lepanto, which is this gigantic sea battle between Ottoman sailors and Navy men against the Holy League, which is like this giant It's almost like the Avengers of like Catholic Europe, because all these different parties band together to stop the Ottomans.
Yeah.
There's the Spanish. There's all the Spanish holdings in Italy. The Catholic Church and the Papal States even show up and throw their support behind it. The Venetians send in their best naval units to take on the Ottomans, and they're able to beat them because the Ottomans are really more of a land power than a sea power. So on the oceans, they're pretty much stopped and shut down.
So it sounds like during this era, it's a lot of just Italy as we know it today, right? But like all these different Italian city-states just getting caught up in like conquest and getting taken over, wars, like a lot of just turbulence. They're just kind of getting blown with the wind in this era. Is that right?
Exactly. They're pretty much at the mercy of all these other players, many of which are not even based in Italy. Like they're the Habsburgs and Austrians, and they're based in Austria, so that's Central Europe. And then you got the French, who have control over some of Italy, and they're in Western Europe. And then you got the Spanish, all the way in Iberia.
Exactly. It's just a lot of chaos.
Yeah. So
okay.
What else was I going to say? And then from there, there's also the Great Turkish War of 1683 to 1699, which is, I think, kind of the last big expansion of the Ottoman Empire across land. Because if
Okay.
Lepanto is the high water mark of the Ottomans on the water, the Great Turkish War of 1683 is kind of their last great hurrah on land. They
Okay.
don't collapse right after this, but their expansion really starts to crumble after the 1680s and into like the 1700s. It's where the Ottomans start getting called the sick man of Europe. They're just not really expanding anymore, and they start to fall behind because there's a long era of peace across the Ottoman Empire, and they
Okay.
start to lose the arms race against the Europeans.
I know it's kind of like this is a very side topic, but it almost seems that for like empires, peace might not be the best thing. Like you kind of just got to constantly stay at war to remain in power to kind of keep your industries flowing. I don't know. There's just something to that. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yes, and I think in the Ottomans' case, part of that is also just because if they had kept fighting, I think they would have been forced to modernize sooner. They would have been forced to
there you
put
go.
in more reforms and to keep up with the rest of Europe. Because by I think like the mid 1700s, early 1800s, they had fallen pretty much beyond the point of return.
Wow.
Yeah, they were facing off against increasingly industrialized European powers who just had better artillery, better riflemen and musketeers who could just take down much larger Ottoman formations. They also were dealing with the thing is they were just dealing with modern nation states, whereas the Ottoman Empire is still an antiquated kind of empire system. The same way that like the Chinese Empire at this point, the same way that the Indians who have just been colonized by the British are a very pre-modern kind of state structure.
Okay. I'm kind of taking a turn, although I know it's not like really specific to Italy, right, in this era, but I know the Enlightenment also is going on, right?
Yes, the Enlightenment I don't think had as much of an impact on Italy because it's the average Italian I think was still very poor, and they didn't have the same kind of leeway to engage in all the same like intellectual pursuits that the rest of Europe did.
Where was it going on again?
Mostly Northern Europe.
Mostly
So
Northern
it's
Europe.
like,
Okay.
England, France, particularly Northern France, Germany, all across the German regions. I think some parts of Scandinavia too. Pretty much wherever there were Northern Europeans and Protestants, the Enlightenment wasn't too far behind.
Man, why does Northern Europe always got to enjoy all the fun stuff?
I guess it's kind of a reversal because back during the days of the Romans, they were the barbarians.
Oh, you're right. Yes,
Yeah,
yeah,
so
absolutely.
In a sense, the whole paradigm is flipped because there's a time where
Yeah,
Southern
wow.
Europe was the center of culture, learning, advancement, civilization, and if you weren't from there and you were up in North, in a way, they weren't even really considered the same race because the Southern Italians are a bit on the darker skin side. They have like darker features.
Yeah,
Their view is
yeah.
that if you have like blonde hair and blue eyes, you're probably a barbarian.
That's an insane. I never thought of it that way, and I kind of forgot about how we talked about like the barbarians of today could be the leaders of tomorrow, right?
Yes,
That's what that was one of our takeaways from the last episode, or one of the last episodes.
Yeah,
I forgot.
the Romans didn't really have any sense of like pan-European brotherhood. There were
Wow.
Romans, and then there were barbarians who had to be conquered,
Okay.
or at the very least kept out of Rome.
Okay, so then the Enlightenment's going on in this era too, but it's not really specific to Italy.
Yeah, there were several events going on. Like there was the War of Spanish Succession, which is where the heavily inbred king of the Habsburgs is on his deathbed, and as he's dying, he decides to give up his empire to the French, which would have united most of Europe and pretty much turned them into an unstoppable juggernaut for everyone else who wasn't in that fold.
Okay.
So quickly, the British, the Dutch, who else? I forget who else it was, but I think it was mostly the British and the Dutch just team up against I think the Swedish too were also on board with that. They team up against the Spanish-French alliance, and they crush them.
Oh.
And later there's another that was the War of Spanish Succession in I think
War of Spanish Succession,
1700.
okay.
But
Okay.
then there's later another War of Austrian Succession where they're just more what are they called? Just different factions within the Habsburgs fighting over control, and they aren't sure who's supposed to control the land. So because of that, different possessions in Italy get transferred. Like the War of Spanish Succession takes the Spanish possessions in Italy and gives it to Austria, and the War of Austrian Succession puts Parma, Piacenza, and Guastalla, which are all parts of Italy, to the Spanish Habsburgs instead.
It sounds like you're listing a lot of really good Italian foods. I'm sorry. It kind of sounds like
Because
it's just making me hungry.
Italy's really known for these days. It's the cuisine.
It's
the
salami
culture.
and charcuterie.
Yeah.
All right, no, for sure.
The two
Wars.
big scientists of the 1700s in Italy would have to be Alessandro Volta, and he's the guy who actually creates the first proto battery. He realizes that if you soak bits of paper in acid and then put them in between bits of copper wire, you can actually generate a kind of electric current.
What was he like? What frame of mind did he have to be in to try that combo?
Well, I don't really know what types of drugs were available in the 1700s,
Oh, yeah.
so
That's
I can't really
crazy.
say.
No, okay. So wait, is that where we get the word the measurement volt
Yes,
from?
yeah, Alessandro Volta is kind of the
Okay.
father of the volt system.
Okay.
And then there's Luigi Galvani, and he's the guy who discovers that if you electrify a dead frog, you can actually make its legs twitch because the electricity actually affects the muscles. So even if the frog's
yeah.
dead, you can still like make it move as though it's still alive.
Yes.
I think that's kind of what eventually feeds into the mythos behind Frankenstein.
I was
Like,
literally
the
just
idea that the
Yep.
like the electricity and lightning can actually create life within like a corpse.
Wow. All right. So there's a lot of scientific advancement as well.
Yeah, not
Cool.
mostly not in Italy, but across Europe, and eventually that seeping into Italy. You
Okay.
have all these different new inventions, but the big developments are actually not scientific ones, but ideological ones. And
Okay.
the main one is nationalism.
Ah,
So Napoleon
our
is
favorite word.
Yeah, so Napoleon starts off as an artillery officer in the French army
Napoleon,
during
okay.
the Revolution, and he quickly climbs up the ranks and eventually becomes the emperor because he's just very successful, and he grabs power from the infighting the French revolutionaries because they're mostly spending time cutting each other's heads off during the Reign of Terror.
So you say he starts off as an officer in the French army, right?
Yeah, he's an artillery officer.
So if he's in the French army, that means he's obviously on the side of the government in France that's trying to that they're trying to overthrow. Is that correct?
He's on the side of the revolutionaries as
Oh,
like
he
the
is. I'm sorry.
national French army because they were overthrowing the monarchy.
Okay, sorry, I didn't know about
think
that.
he was working for the monarchs. He was a
Oh,
revolutionary.
okay, so he was a revolutionary. Okay,
Yeah. He's also a nationalist, and he's expanding the idea of nationalism and the idea that a nation should be run by the people of a certain culture and language and ethnicity.
okay,
And this eventually spreads into Italy. It doesn't take over overnight, but he does. But by establishing the Kingdom of Italy in the northern part of the country, and by what's the word? By showing that it's possible for nation states to work inside Europe, he sets the stage for later revolutionaries like those in 1848 to try to stage their own takeovers of the country under a nation state system.
okay. So the idea of nation states and nationalism is really starting to take. I mean, that's a modern idea now, right? But like, this is where it really starts to take form, right?
Yeah, because at this point in the late 1700s, early 1800s, nationalism is still a very new kind of idea.
Okay.
I mean, the Americans had their own national revolution in North America, but they were a colony and they were detaching themselves pretty heavily from the European tradition.
Yeah.
So that
yeah.
was kind of considered, I think, kind of an anomaly. And the same is true for all the Latin American countries who rebelled against Spain.
Mm-hmm.
Though that's actually still ongoing in this era too.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Yeah, but then eventually it starts to reach a critical mass, and you start getting these secret societies across Europe, like across Italy, like the Carbonari, known as the charcoal burners. There are these intellectuals and I think some Freemasons too, because it's all a very kind of elite type of society for learned men who want to advance Italy through whatever means they can.
Okay. So they kind of creep out of the shadows one day and kind of just show up on the scene.
Yeah, they show up. They start organizing meetings. They begin planning what a future Italian state would look like.
The Carbonari, right?
Yeah,
They're
the
called
Carbonari.
Okay, the Carbonari.
But really, in order to do that, they can't just negotiate their way into statehood. To do that, they actually have to fight for their territory.
Of course.
And to do that, they enlist men like what's his name, Giuseppe Garibaldi, one of the great heroes of the Italian reunification. He actually spent most of his career fighting wars in South America, like in Uruguay and I think in southern Brazil too. He was known as a kind of like a traveling soldier of fortune. He would just go to different countries where they were rebelling against the Spanish, and he would fight on their side, and he would gain more and more experience in what it means to be a rebellious kind of soldier.
What's his name?
Giuseppe Garibaldi.
Giuseppe Garibaldi.
Yeah, also known as the hero of the two worlds, because he fought in the New World, as in like South America, But later he would also fight and make his name known in Italy, which is part of the Old World.
Yeah. Wow. Almost reminds you of like a Che Guevara. That's kind of what he was.
I mean,
he wanted to go
in a way, he kind of is like the Che Guevara of the 19th century.
Like he starts in Cuba, well, starts in Argentina, goes to Mexico on like a trip, participates in the Cuban Revolution.
Garibaldi actually did fight in Argentina too, so
wow.
I guess that's kind of a similarity between them.
Yeah, I say because then after the Cuban Revolution, Che Guevara he wants to go on and start revolutions in South America to overthrow America, or just your Western influence in general.
Che Guevara traveled all across Latin America, leading and inspiring different, what are they called? I think not just communist movements, but also like socialist movements,
like
anti-colonial
guerrilla movements,
all of that, and eventually ends up in Bolivia, where he's killed by the army.
Yeah.
I believe part of that was actually because Fidel Castro himself believed Che was becoming too powerful within Cuba. It would be better if he wasn't challenging his role there.
That's wild. That's a wild thought. Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, there are other figures too, like Giuseppe Mazzini, who is one of the leading intellectual leaders and fathers of the Italian reunification.
Okay.
And there's Camillo Benso of Cavour, and he was the prime minister of the Kingdom of Sardinia, of Piedmont, Sardinia.
Okay.
And in 1861, Victor Emmanuel II becomes the king of the Kingdom of Italy. And by 1870, I think they've taken most, if not all, of the peninsula, except there's this one area that they haven't, which is the Papal States. But after because the French are still propping them up, because that's kind of like their last foothold within the Italian peninsula.
Got you.
But then the Germans invade under the Prussians. That's the Franco-Prussian War of 1870.
Okay.
And then in 1871, they managed to take over because the French leave and they're able to take over the Papal States.
So kind of tying it to the Napoleonism, right? Like Napoleon brings about these nationalistic ideas, right? And then you have these, like you said, these learned kind of like secret society figures that kind of take on those ideas, and not that they're all working together like consciously, but this movement kind of builds to reunify Italy. Is that correct? That's kind of the bigger picture going on here.
Yeah, they eventually converge on the Kingdom of Italy and eventually the expansion of that kingdom throughout the entire peninsula, from north all the way down to the south in Sicily.
But it starts with just like kind of mercenary type, because they obviously, like you said, they can't bargain for their power. They have to take the power, right? From who are they taking the power from?
They're taking it from the French in the case of the Papal State. Well, the Papal States is kind of its own independent entity ruled by the Pope as like an absolute monarch.
Got you.
Yeah, the Papal States at this point are also a really hated regime because there's no democracy there, and the Pope is just really kind of punitive to his own people. His own people living in the Papal States don't like him.
Gotcha.
And he's also really nasty to the Papal States' Jewish population. Like there's a famous case in 57 or 58 where a Jewish boy is claimed to have been I think his one of the boy's nurses or aides claims that his mother converted to Catholicism before she gave birth, which later turns out to be completely made up. It's a bogus story.
Yeah.
But because of that, the Catholic Church kidnaps this Jewish kid from his family and refuses to give him back. Eventually raises him as a Catholic, which raises an uproar across all of Europe. Because they're not exactly very tolerant of Jews, but this is viewed as going too far, even for those by those standards.
Wow. Aye. Okay. So does that pretty much, like you say, you mentioned the Franco-Prussian War. I know that's in the late 1870s, late 19th century, which kind of is, I would assume this is kind of where the stage begins to start getting set for World War I, even though it's pretty early, right? Is that a good assumption?
Yeah, this is the Belle Epoque, which is kind of a golden age in European history.
Okay.
After Napoleon's defeat, Europe sets up the system called the Concert of Europe, which is, I suppose, kind of like an early form of the League of Nations or the UN, where all the great powers of Europe agree not to fight each other.
Oh.
Because whenever the great powers fight, you get a world war. You get this gigantic conflict that leads to millions and millions of people being killed. So they try to avoid that. They don't entirely avoid it because there's the Crimean War in 1853, where the British and the French gang up on Russia to stop them from taking over the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah. Okay, so we're kind of hitting the end of the early modern era then, right?
Yeah, we're entering the what's called the late modern era.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah.
So then what can we... Okay, so just a big high-level overview, right? We've got... what are we looking at? starts kind of with the Spanish Empire. There's a lot of voyages. There's a lot of conquest. There's Columbus. Okay. And then we kind of touched on the Italian Wars and the Protestant Reformation. Let's see, what else did we touch over? We touched over the Ottomans and their influence over the region. The Enlightenment, okay. Napoleon, and kind of what we just talked about with the reunification of Italy. What can we conclude from all this, right? Like, what's if we have takeaways at the end of each episode that we try to harp on, right? What are some takeaways that we can take from the early modern era?
Well, the big takeaway, I think, just for the story of Italy and its reunification is that people are often underestimated.
Yeah.
Because there was a time when Italy wasn't even considered a country; it was just a geographic term.
Okay.
And it was just the peninsula. It was a land that was owned by other people, by the Spaniards, by the French, by the Austrians, and occasionally by independent states within Italy too. But those were their own independent entities, like Venice or the Papal States.
Okay.
But eventually, because they believed in their cause and they were able to create this coherent vision of a unified Italy, they eventually managed to kick out all the foreign occupiers and created their own country.
Yeah.
It also shows that ideas have consequences, because without the belief in nationalism and without the belief in like the progress towards from kingdoms and duchies into a unified nation state for the people, none of this would have come to be.
Okay.
But it's also interesting because in retrospect, it shows how ideologies and movements change over time.
Yeah.
Because in a sense, you could kind of argue that the nationalists were actually something of leftists, because they were rebelling against the authorities of the time, the monarchs, and in the Papal States case, the Pope himself.
Yeah.
But over time, nationalism would go from being a movement to give a voice to the people to being a kind of a right-wing reactionary type of ideology that's about excluding people and about racial supremacy.
Yeah, it almost seems that nationalism...
Yeah, and today nationalism is a very dirty word. But though back in the day, it was a dirty word, but it was more because it was a rebellion against the status quo, not because it was a more regressive kind of status quo.
Yeah, yeah.
And then, of course, there's also the point that progress isn't inevitable, because none of this was really inevitable. I mean, if things had gone differently, Italy could probably still be divided even today.
Yeah, there has to be intentional...
Yeah, and perhaps more chillingly, the late stage of the Italian reunification. So in the 1870s is, as I mentioned before, the Belle Epoque, the golden age of peace in Europe, where art was flourishing, science was flourishing, national sovereignty was flourishing. But at the same time, it was just a few decades before the outbreak of World War I.
Wow.
And the rise of the fascists in Italy, and really across all of Europe.
I mean, it's kind of a... what just came to mind was a little similarity of today. I mean, you think of like 2019, right? Like the economy seemed to be booming, things seemed to be going really well, and right before COVID. And then what I'm saying is, like, before COVID happened, things seemed to be going very well here, right? And I think there's hardship now that even like I would feel on that in my own life, right? That was not there before COVID in 2020. So it just goes to show.
Yeah, it seems unfortunately that the golden ages really don't last, and the same is true for like the 1990s, because right after the Soviet Union fell, there was this a lot of optimism that the whole world would eventually become prosperous, free, democratic, and liberal, but that didn't happen. Instead, we got a war on terror, and then a global pandemic and recession. So,
all right, Devin. Well, thank you for the we ran through a lot of history pretty quickly, but thank you for explaining all that and answering my questions.
You're very welcome.
Next week or next episode, I think we're going to touch on the late modern era, and that's going to be
late modern era and even the contemporary era of Italian history.
Yeah, then that's some stuff that I think that everyone's going to be a little more familiar with.
Yeah, we'll have to make them a deal they can't refuse.
All right, Devin, thank you.